I needed to do everything I could to help the Latter-day Saints understand and love the Old Testament as much as possible.
I have the ability to share and inspire people with literature and history, but then also financially be able to help those less fortunate.
But we found that the Lord needed us, and I think there's a reason why we were there when we were there.
Hello and welcome to Latter-day Profiles. I'm Brian Howard. We're here at the LDS Motion Picture Studio in Provo, Utah, and joining me today is Kerry Muhlestein. Kerry, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Great to have you. Kerry is a professor of ancient scripture at BYU, also director of the BYU Egypt excavation project, and has done lots of things and will help us out maybe a little bit with our Isaiah understanding. You've got some books out there and have studied a lot in the ancient scripture, especially the Old Testament, that kind of thing. So, Kerry, just a pleasure to have you.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here.
Let's talk a little bit about your background. It always interests me because, going into something like ancient scripture and those kind of studies, what brought a lot around? Was it, watching Indiana Jones as a kid? Or?
No, although I did like Indiana Jones as a kid, but it was really, at some point I decided I wanted to teach for a living. I'd always thought that in high school, but I thought they don't make enough money, so I don't want to do it. It turns out to be true, but I just put it off. But then at some point I thought I really want to teach, and I thought I want to teach seminary or institute. And as I was kind of aiming for that, I saw what some people could do who had gotten degrees in Hebrew Bible, and I just fell in love with it. I just got hooked on it, and as I started to study that and I had some research jobs, I realized I loved researching as much as I loved teaching. I loved both, and there aren't many options for both. Really, if you're going to do both, you need to be a university professor. So I set my sights on that and on getting some degrees that would help me be as good at it as possible. I wanted to feel satisfied by saying I've done everything I could to do what I want to do as well as I can, the path that I was taking as well as I can, and so I just pursued along those lines.
So your educational background, where did you end up going?
So I did my undergrad at BYU actually in psychology, and then as I said, I kind of switched partway through, so I ended up getting a Hebrew minor. The psychology's always actually been helpful. I focused on social psychology, and I think you can use that a lot as you study ancient cultures. Then I did my master's also at BYU, focusing, it was Ancient Near Eastern Studies is the title, but really it was Hebrew Bible. But I also at that point started to focus on Egyptology. I'd fallen in love with ancient Egypt, largely because I thought if I'm going to understand the language of the Old Testament, the language of temples and things like that, I have to understand the language of symbolism. And no one does symbols like the Egyptians. So I started to study ancient Egypt, and I just fell hook, line, and sinker for that. I loved it. I felt like that was something I could study that would maybe avoid some of the contention that you have in biblical studies. I wasn't planning on going into Book of Abraham studies at the time, so now that I get as much or more contention. So that didn't quite work out how I thought, but I fell in love with ancient Egypt. So I went to UCLA for my Ph.D. and did that in Egyptology with a secondary emphasis of Hebrew language and literature.
Mm-hmm. So now you're teaching. It's interesting because you're research and teaching, but sometimes people say, research, but it sounds like that's also a great part of what you like to do. What kind of things do you get to do in your research?
Oh, yeah, all sorts of stuff, and I love all of it. It really, I just find so many things I'd like to know more about that. I'd like to know more about that. And you just start going down that hole of research, and it's fun. Sometimes it comes from classes. So for example, I've done some work on how the revelations of the Joseph Smith translation interact with the revelations of the Doctrine and Covenants. That came from some comments some students made in class. And I thought, I don't know the answer to that. I'd like to know the answer to that. Some things I've written, a book and a lot of articles on the Abrahamic Covenant, or the New and Everlasting Covenant, really came about because I teach Old Testament and Book of Abraham, Pearl of Great Price and the Book of Abraham in there. And Abrahamic Covenant was coming up again and again, and I felt like my students aren't quite getting this, and so I felt like I need to understand it better to help them understand it better. And so I just kept researching more and more, and that turned into some really lengthy and exciting research projects. And so a lot of it's come out of class, but some of it's come out of just when people have had questions that they wanted to find answers for, and I realize there's not an answer, and I think, let's see what we can do to find an answer to that.
Okay, I wrote down you've got at least, I was reading your bio, over 60 peer-reviewed articles, which people know what peer-reviewed is. You submit it, your peers review it to make sure it's up to snuff, and obviously they are. At least 9 books. I don't know if you have more than that.
Not yet. Some in the works, but that's all right now.
Somewhere there. So one, we're going to talk about learning to love Isaiah, which a lot of us probably need to learn that. Talk about Abraham, which I've really enjoyed in the Come Follow Me. In fact, we don't want to talk about that because I think the Come Follow Me has, inspired a lot of us to get deeper into the scriptures than they have in the past.
Yeah.
And I noticed that you've been a part of your own podcast. I've been a guest on lots of other podcasts. Have you noticed that? Is that the kind of this influx of more interest in the scriptures, especially this year we're doing the Old Testament?
Absolutely. And I'm, at least so far I'm seeing, and I only have a limited view of what I see. I don't get out to all the world, but I'm seeing an interest in the Old Testament that I was afraid wouldn't happen. So I feel like with Come Follow Me, we have gotten, and maybe it's a combination of Come Follow Me and COVID, but we've gotten into studying the scriptures, I think, more enthusiastically than I've ever seen as a church membership as a whole. And I had this fear. We were loving doing, Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants, but I had this fear that when we hit Old Testament, that people would be afraid. It would be a little bit like Isaiah in 1 Nephi, like their people are loving 1 Nephi, and then they get to Isaiah and they're like, never mind, I'm done with Book of Mormon. So I was afraid of that, and I can remember really back in November, I just woke up one morning and I knew I needed to do everything I could to help the Latter-day Saints understand and love the Old Testament as much as possible. So I decided to start a podcast. It's called The Scriptures Are Real. I made a really ugly website because I'm not good at websites, but outofthedust.org, where I've put all sorts of resources to help people understand the Old Testament. Like you said, I've been on other people's podcasts, especially lately as we've been doing Abraham and so on. I don't know, I've been on like 3 or 4 or sometimes 5 a week. And just plus creating my own, I'm just trying to, and I'm not the only one, I think there are a bunch of us who are trying to do everything we can to help people be able to love and understand the Old Testament. And I'm getting the feeling that people are. There's still some fear, and I think as we get to Isaiah, there may be some more of a love-hate relationship. And I find Latter-day Saints often, they want to love the Old Testament, they want to love Isaiah, they feel like they should, but there's some things about it that are just a little hard, and so they struggle with it. But I'm grateful for all the podcasts and resources, others, and that I'm trying to make available, that it feels like people are saying, okay, I'm getting more out of this than ever before, and the enthusiasm, at least as far as I can tell, is staying. People are still into it. Now, I may have a skewed view because people who talk to me kind of have to at least pretend like they like the Old Testament, but I feel like we're getting this, and that these resources are helping.
Yeah, they are. For me, when doing Come Follow with a family, or if you're in a class, having those resources to give you some additional insights, because of course the Come Follow Me materials the church provides are a great outline, but you got to get into it.
Yeah.
And some of the things are a little bit more difficult to understand. And, are there some, obviously I wish there was some magic key, of course, to suddenly make you understand, but we're talking about a clear, thousands of years ago, trying to figure out what was going on to understand it. Are there some things that can help folks as they're getting into it, to say, okay, here's some things that will help you as you get into the Old Testament. They'll make life a little easier for you. Yeah, there are some things that I think really do make a difference. And I've done some firesides on it that you can find on that outofthedust.org website, but I'll give you just a couple quick highlights here. One of the things I think is to study symbols. As I said, that's kind of what I felt I needed to come to understand if I was going to understand the Old Testament. And by symbols, I don't just mean, okay, the tree of life, what does that symbolize? Although that's certainly part of it. But for ancient Israel, symbolic action was hugely important. And so when we start to look at the action and the way people behaved and what God did with them as a way of communication, when we understand, this is something that's happening because they are expecting God to speak through symbolic action, that opens things up for us. That will help us understand why Miriam is struck with leprosy. Because if she challenges Moses, it's not enough for Moses to say, you're wrong. There has to be a symbolic action that's part of that. It will help us understand why the Exodus happens the way it does. And other various stories, we just look for those symbolic actions. And then I'd say the other thing is two other things. One, just be aware it's a different culture, right? And they have different ways of taking care of the poor or of behaving in families than we do. But even while it's a different culture, they're the same people.
right? They have the same kinds of desires and hopes and disappointments and sorrows and struggles that we do. And I love that the Old Testament shows us the whole big messy picture. Rather than a sanitized version, they say, well, here's where Jacob was struggling to figure out how to interact with his family. And here's where Rebekah was having to kind of nudge Isaac a little bit and so on. And then look for the whole story. So often we look at God doing something like striking Miriam with leprosy, and we don't look at the next part. We say, well, that was pretty big, but we don't look at the next part, which is, well, he healed her, and he had Israel wait until she could move forward with him, and then they move forward, right? He doesn't leave her behind. He heals her. The symbolic action that taught her something wasn't the end. He kept working with her. And if you look at the story of Israel as a whole, you'll see that God has to punish them again and again and again, but that's never the end of the story. He then stops and waits and helps to heal them, helps them come back to him, and then he works with them again, and he does that unendingly. And so I actually think we find God's mercy and his love more in the Old Testament than any other book of Scripture. And it talks about the atoning sacrifice of Christ more than any other book of Scripture. In fact, the book of Leviticus uses the word atonement more than the Book of Mormon, the New Testament, and the Doctrine and Covenants combined, just in that one book in the Old Testament. So it's in there, but we have to look for it and see it, rather than if we see something we don't expect and it jars us and we just kind of stop processing the story then. Look for how the story ends and look for God's mercy.
Right. Right, as if, we just gone past a few weeks ago with Jacob and Esau and people trying to figure out what's going on with Rebekah, why is wearing hairy clothes to pretend that he's Esau and that kind of thing. But in the end, it all works out according to the way God wanted it to. Yeah. So I guess some things like that can leave us a little bit wondering what's going on, because we don't really understand the full picture of what's happening.
And I hope it gives us hope. I hope that we can see that and say, okay, well, God had to work with them in a couple different ways to get them where they were supposed to be. Then it's okay that he's having to work with me in a couple different ways. And the fact that I've had to be nudged and start over, and I do better and then I don't and then I do. God seems to be patient with them as he gets them to where they need to be and have what happens need to happen or start to happen. And I assume then he's going to be that patient with me. And that gives me some hope to see these messy, kind of difficult ways of working with people and have it work out. You get touches of that in the Book of Mormon, but mostly because Mormon's just covering so much so quickly and somewhat sanitizing it. You get hints of Nephi maybe wasn't perfect in his interactions with his brothers, but mostly that's glossed over. You get hints of how difficult this family situation is for Nephi, but mostly that's just glossed over. But in the Old Testament, you see how difficult it is, and you see how sorrowful it is, and you see God nudging them like we only see a little bit of with Nephi. And I assume it happened with everyone that way. But the Old Testament is spectacular at bringing it to us so that we can see how much we are like them.
I'm assuming, because so many of us have read the Book of Mormon, many times, you see the connections, you know what's going to happen. The Old Testament, probably not as much. I would admit I have not even come close to reading the Old Testament like I've read the Book of Mormon. And one thing I'm discovering as I'm getting better at it is as you start to understand the background of the people and their interconnections, it's like those aha moments. Yeah. Like the first time when you're a kid and read the Book of Mormon for more than just the scripture, there's actually, these are people that actually did something. Are there things that you've discovered as you've gone through? Obviously, you have lots of discoveries. You've been studying this forever. Any particular things that stand out in your mind as you're going through, whether it's Abraham or Isaac, that stand out as things that would help us, I guess, better understand the culture of the times and those kind of things? Yeah,
there are lots of things, and actually that's kind of what my podcast is aimed at, is the elements that make the scriptures become real to us. I think maybe the importance of family to them that's maybe the top thing, and how family connections just keep coming again and again. So you see it obviously in the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph stories. One that's coming to mind right away that a lot of people don't see is a story that has to do with Saul, and even right before Saul. So the book of Judges ends with this terrible story. I think it's the Israelites saying, this is when we were at our worst, where there's a concubine who's gang raped to death, and then all the tribes go to war against Benjamin as a result, and then the men there are women from Jabesh Gilead that end up kind of being forced to marry the Benjaminites because everyone else has been killed off. But that's interesting, because it turns out that Saul is related to these people of Jabesh Gilead. And one of the first stories you see with Saul, and people kind of miss that, but his mom is probably from Jabesh Gilead. And so one of the first things you see with Saul that he does as a king, and it's when people start to say, oh, he really is a king we should follow, is he goes to war because the people at Jabesh Gilead are being besieged. And he goes to war and he conquers and he wins, and they say, okay, this is a king we can follow. And then when Saul dies, it's the people of Jabesh, and the Philistines take his body and hang it on a wall to mock him and let the crows come and get it and everything else. And the men of Jabesh Gilead go on this kind of overnight raid to get his body off the wall and bury it. And that's all interesting stories, but when you see the family connection that he's going to help family members and now they're coming to help his dead body, but help him, then it just becomes something we can relate to a little bit more, because we see how family is important, and we can see, well, I'd go for my cousin, right? And so noticing and paying attention to little things like that can help us understand the story a little bit better.
Right. And I think what you mentioned before is, we've got the Book of Mormon, was compiled, and that we kind of have this more raw telling of stories that might disturb us a little bit, but that's what was going on, and kind of accept that we don't live in that age, but that's what's going on.
Yeah. Probably the same way that my journal would disturb someone else, right? If the unedited journal, like, oh, that was dumb of him, right? But anyway, that's kind of how it is.
That's the way it goes. Well, let's talk a little bit about Isaiah. You've written a book about that. What was the impetus for writing about Isaiah? Was it people like me who kept coming to you and say, I don't get what's going on?
It's a bit that. It was that people seem to have this love-hate relationship with Isaiah, and it causes unpleasant and complicated feelings among Latter-day Saints, because they have been told, study Isaiah, greater the words of Isaiah. You need to learn from Isaiah, and then they read it and they say, I don't get it. And now they aren't going to study it, but they feel guilty about not studying it, or they study it, but they don't enjoy it and they feel guilty about not enjoying it. And I thought, there's some great stuff here. It's beautiful, it's powerful, but it is difficult. And so we just need to help people understand it. So I asked if I could, ask my department chair if I could write this commentary while I was teaching classes on Isaiah, and I would kind of take what I was writing and bring it into the classroom, and then find out from the students what was working, what wasn't, what they needed more help with, and bring that back to my writing. And it was kind of 3 years of working, really in some ways 4, working through that I created this commentary. It's a guide where it gives you ideas of just general concepts of how to understand Isaiah, but then it's also a verse-by-verse commentary. I think the most thorough one. We've got great stuff by some of my friends who have written great things on Isaiah, but I think this is the first one that addresses every single verse and more extensively than we've ever done before. So you'll have in one column the King James Version of Isaiah, and then in the other column, which is usually much longer, my commentary on it, where I'll talk about the places, cultural elements that might help you understand things, language elements, and then how it can apply to different time periods in different ways. And so hopefully with these general principles, and then someone kind of holding your hand, and that's why we call it a guide. It's kind of based off this idea where Philip encounters a eunuch, and he asked him if he understands Isaiah, and he said, how can I except someone guide me? Right? So we're helping you learn to love it, but I'm also guiding you through it. And hopefully as you have both of those happening at the same time, it opens up to you and you just love Isaiah.
Yeah, I hope so. And as we're recording this, but when people are watching this, will be about the time we're in Isaiah and Come Follow Me. So it'll be a great resource as you're sitting there, with your family trying to explain things. Because I think that's one of the bigger struggles. As you're going through, it's a good thing to have people who can guide us through. What steps do you take? This is a lot of research to understand the background. I think that's probably the hardest part, is maybe we just don't understand a lot of the background, the names. Who are these people when they're talking about, we mentioned Maher al-Shashbaz.
Maher al-Hashbaz.
Right. Can't pronounce it well. So I'm guessing a lot of people appreciate that help to get us some of that background. You've already done the hard work for it.
That's what I've tried to do. So, and it's still, you're going to have to do hard work on your own. So my biggest suggestion with Isaiah would be to slow down. You're not going to get Isaiah in a hurry. So there is a price that's going to have to be paid. So if we're going to do all those Isaiah chapters, and we do like 5 or 6 weeks in Come Follow Me, and you're still not doing all of Isaiah, but even so, it's quite a bit. You're probably going to need a little more time for this than you do for some First Kings reading, where it's storyline. For Isaiah, slow down. Take the time to say, okay, what does that mean? And again, he's got symbols and symbolic action, so stop and say, what does this symbol mean? And try and understand the original symbol first. He's talking about threshing. What did threshing look like? Okay, how might that apply to his day? How might that apply to the last days? How might that apply to me as an individual Israelite? And kind of slow down and go through those things and try and piece it together. I would say also stop to think about Isaiah as a master of imagery. What he does is he doesn't want you just to understand what he's saying. He wants you to feel it. He wants you to feel what he's feeling as he sees visions or as he makes prophecies. He wants you to feel what's going on, and he helps you feel it by creating images. So he'll have some images that are obviously exaggeration, but the point is to help you feel the desperation or the pain or the sorrow or whatever else. And so take the time to think about those images and feel it. And then, like you said, hopefully some of the heavy lifting for that I've done, and I've provided things for you. But these days you can get online and investigate any symbol, any place, and say, well, why did he name that place? Well, look at where it is in relation to Jerusalem or whatever else, and take that time, and you'll start to have these things come together for you, I think.
Yeah, I guess there's no substitute for just the hard work to put into to make sure you understand that.
Yeah.
Because, it'd be nice to have it all just poured into our heads. It's not going to work that way.
Well, hopefully we've lessened. Hopefully I've lightened the load. That's been the point and the goal.
Well, it's good to have some, I guess, a guide, like you said, a little key to help you understand, and then you can move ahead on your own.
Yeah.
I did want to talk about this Egyptian excavation project.
Yeah.
Sounds like you've had some great travels. Tell me a little bit about that, what you've been able to do, and what that means to go and do this excavation.
It's great stuff. It's time-consuming stuff, but it's great stuff. So I've been involved with the excavation since 2007. I became the director in 2011. We have a couple of parts of this excavation that BYU has been doing for a long time, since 1980. There's a pyramid. It's a 4th dynasty pyramid, so built by Snefru. He builds 4 pyramids. His son builds the Great Pyramid. I'm making the argument that I don't know that we can be 100% sure, but pretty sure that this is a true pyramid, meaning not stepped, but with these smooth sides. And if so, it's either the first or it's tied for the first. I think it's being built in conjunction with another one, so it's probably tied as being one of the first true pyramids. So we're excavating that. There's also a Greco-Roman cemetery that spans a very long time period and witnesses the conversion to Christianity. So it's all of the original inhabitants of this cemetery are first of all Egyptian or people from other places that we know there are people from all over that settled in that area, but what we would call pagan. But by the time they're done using this cemetery, almost all of them have become Christian. So you can kind of study the effects that might have on burial and things like that. So there are a lot of fun and exciting things to do as you work on excavating in Egypt.
Yeah, when I think about excavation, I'm thinking of, and I don't know if this is right, sandstorm, digging with brushes, kind of thing. What steps do you go through? How do you actually go about your excavation?
Yeah, well, the vast majority of it is preparation ahead of time, working with government officials, making sure you have all the equipment, all of the funding. Fundraising is a big part, unfortunately, all that kind of a thing. And then when you get there, I have a team that I work with that I bring with me, and a team that's there, the locals that, like our 2 foremen, they've been doing this since they were like 15. They are so good at this. And you go up, sandstorms are a real thing. We've excavated in some pretty bad wind, and sometimes you just have to stop because you can't do it, and you come back the next day and half of what you've done has been covered in. We've done it in this last season. The first day we got up to the pyramid, it was 103 degrees. We try and do that less often, but sometimes that's the only choice, is to just go when it's hot. And we've had people dealing with heat stroke, some of my team members and so on. And sometimes it's moving huge amounts of sand. And sometimes we're down there with, like you say, little brushes and even those little things that you use to kind of extract things out of a baby's nose. You can use that to blow sand away. So we're using those and little brushes. And then the key is to record, and then come back and spend. So we'll excavate for about a month. And then you spend the next 11 months analyzing and writing and trying to publish, so that you're just a tomb robber if you don't publish this stuff. So we try and publish it so that it's preserved. We're trying to make a database. We're in the midst of creating that. It's going, but we're adding to it so that anyone can access the information about what we've excavated. So it's just a lot of fun. I love the place. I love the culture, and I love the things we find, and that feeling of discovery as you're looking and finding something that no one's seen before for up at the pyramid, we're talking about 4,500 years ago. So that's fun.
Ask you, what would be an example of like kind of an exciting find? This is like, I found this. This is a cool thing.
So I'll name one. I'd say my predecessor, Wilfred Griggs, who did the excavation before me, he's found more than I have. He did it for a very long time. But one that we uncovered recently that was really exciting to me, he'd found up along the pyramid some holes, but as we looked at it and did a little bit more excavation, we found that some of these holes, because some of them were for jars that we assume is where they'd make offerings, but some that they'd assume were also for jars. As we uncovered them, we found, no, this looks like it's for a post hole. And then we thought it was only 2, but that doesn't work very well. So as we looked more carefully, we found 4, and it was clear it was for a pavilion. And this is right next to where they are doing some rituals, and it became clear this is where some of these rituals were. They'd found stelae, and I always wondered, why aren't they in the center? Why are they over here? And I realized that the stelae were on either side of this pavilion. And as I did more research, I think this was the forerunner for 2 different pavilions we see down at Giza, his son and grandson and so on, where they do rituals. That this was the first version of that, I think. I've just published a paper on this, but I think it's the first version of that. And that's kind of exciting to say, well, I think we're looking at when they were figuring out how to do what they're going to do for the next 1,000 years. This is the spot where they were figuring that out and innovating and experimenting with it. So most people don't think finding post holes is very exciting, but it was exciting for me.
That sounds great. Well, Kerry, it's been a pleasure to have you. If people want to find out more, you got a book coming out about Isaiah, or it's out already, right?
Yeah.
It's called
Learning to Love Isaiah, a guide and commentary.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then also have the podcast, The Scriptures Are Real, if you want to check that out. So,
yep. And outofthedust.org is my website, and a book on Abraham. Let's talk about the book of Abraham.
Great stuff. Kerry, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.